Hello dears, how's it going? Welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you. Today we're going to have one of those existential conversations. It's a little bit more rooted in like how we conceptualize and talk about things rather than necessarily the practice of how we go about things. And I can very much acknowledge that in the grand scheme of things, academic conversations around what terms to use for stuff can feel a bit pedantic and unhelpful, and energy should instead be pointed toward actual practical help and care and activism, particularly in this current political climate. But also at the same time, I think really getting into the weeds of how we conceptualize things, of what language we choose to use and why, is a really great way to unpack biases that we may not realize we have that impact practice and how we see the world and go about helping our fellow people. All of which to say, this both feels like a very useless video and a very important video at the same time, and I just want to name that. Also, before we dive in, for friends who need it, I am a white young person with light brown shoulder length. I just got a cut curly hair. I'm wearing a white button-up that has birds on it, and I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves. So, according to the dictionary, a disorder is, put simply, an abnormal physical or mental condition. And most medical definitions beyond this usually include something along the lines of that may or may not impact a person's daily life. And I think this definition does a really great job of pointing out the primary concern that people have with the word disorder, in that this definition uses the word abnormal. Because what actually is normal and who gets to decide what normal is? I mean, even if we were to change the word normal to typical, that language can work for some things that are easily measurable and does not work at all for other things that are more subjective experiences, like a lot of mental disorders. Our psychological diagnostic system in particular is often based primarily on self-reporting and the subjective opinion of outside observers, rather than something like, I don't know, a PCR test or a heart rate measurement, which then puts the power of deciding who and what is typical squarely in the hands of the person who's doing the diagnosing, which obviously opens the door for a great deal of potential bias, particularly because the psychological and psychiatric fields are based on white supremacy, as everything else is, and misogyny as everything else is, right? And obviously the diagnoser isn't just deciding based on nothing out of the blue who and what is disordered. It's not just their opinion. They're usually basing it on the framework of the DSM, but that in and of itself was just created by a group of people who, while they have significant clinical experience, still decided based on their biases and ways of looking at the world what and who is disordered, which by extension more or less says that one way of looking at the world is normal or typical and the rest are disordered or atypical. When I took abnormal psych in college, we talked about the main four things that categorize something as disordered. Distress, i.e. this thing is causing a person distress. Deviance, either in the sense that it's infrequent in the population or that it's typically not accepted socially. And dysfunction, meaning it's getting in the way of their day-to-day. There's also dangerousness, which isn't needed in order to diagnose something, but it is something to keep an eye out for as to whether somebody is a danger to themselves or a danger to others. And these things can be quite situational and subjective. A person who has spent their entire life living on a quiet farm is going to be deeply overwhelmed by a pretty small city like Providence, for example, and that is both upsetting to them and getting in the way of them being able to enjoy their time there. Does that mean that their inability to handle the city is disordered, or does it mean that they're just not used to that environment? And some people might say that being overwhelmed by Providence is in fact normal and typical, while others might not. It really just depends on who you ask. It's not the most successful analogy, but hopefully you're getting the general idea of what I'm trying to point out here. We talked about the critiques of disorder and diagnostics a bit in my video on the history of the DSM years ago that I will link above, but some of the main ones are the fact that the word disorder implies that there is something wrong with a person that should be corrected or fixed, and that the social connotation inherently stigmatizes mental health conditions and pathologizes behavior, often in a way that ignores the wider context as to what might be requiring or triggering said behavior. This also isolates the individual as being the one who is wrong and needs to be fixed, rather than looking at the wider environmental cause as to why they might be behaving or thinking in a certain way. But then the question comes into play as to where coping mechanisms become disorders and vice versa, which can also be quite subjective. My personal metric is usually based on distress, like if this thing is not impacting somebody's day-to-day and they don't feel disabled by it and it's neither hurting them nor others, it's fine, but that can also be incredibly situational because like for example, if somebody had a hard time eating certain textures of food and so eats the exact same thing every single day and they're getting all their nutrients and they're happy, that might be a little odd to some people. Other people might consider that to be wrong or disordered or in need of fixing, but I wouldn't consider that to be disordered or disabling because they're getting all the food groups, they're happy, they're healthy, it's not getting in the way to their day-to-day and it's fine. But if they're living in a place where the only food available is a different meal every night from a dining hall or something and they're not able to handle that and thus stop eating, then it does become an issue. I personally spend a lot of my philosophical time pondering wondering at what point is it still disability even if it's fully accommodated all the time, to a point where it's no longer disabling or noticeable. But I also don't think that's entirely possible 100% of the time, and is more of a hypothetical anyway. But I do find it quite interesting because there is a world where, you know, you can have accommodated, say, your ADHD well enough that it is no longer disabling to you. So other people would say, oh, you don't have ADHD, but you still technically have the diagnosis. It's very complicated because in that case, the ADHD is not cured. It's just that you've accommodated it well enough. So do you still have the disability? Yes. But is it disabling? No. So then is it still a disability? That's even more in the weeds than what we're gonna get into here, but I just think it's interesting. The other primary thing that gets pointed out when critiquing disorder is the inherent power dynamic that comes into play. The diagnoser has the power to decide who is disordered and what treatment they should recommend, and in extreme cases has the power to involuntarily hospitalize or otherwise institutionalize the person. Also to sterilize them, because that is still legal under the Supreme Court. And the existence of disorder is often used to silence voices and deny autonomy under the guise of empirical medical fact, which inherently happens more for members of various minorities and perpetuates systems of oppression. I mean, diagnoses are a checklist, so they must be inherently scientific and objective because science is inherently objective and apolitical, right? It's not like the decision as to what normative behavior is and looks like it's solely based on a very particular kind of person who does not represent much of the population. But it's also important that we don't conflate disorder and disability as being the same concept, because they fundamentally are not. Disability is more centered on a condition that I have or a difference that I have that makes it harder for me to interact with the world in a typical way, where disorder is more centered on describing the condition itself. I'm going to quote the Instagram user Neuroabolition here because they said it better than I ever could. Also, please go give them a follow. Their thoughts always make my gears turn and I really like that. You can say something is a disorder without saying it is absolutely a disability. You can say you are limited by your body without saying your body is wrong. You can say your body isn't working in the way you want it to work without saying that your body or any body is wrong because it does not work in the way the majority thinks it should. You can want to and then actually change how your body is or functions without justifying that change by characterizing what you are changing from as bad or wrong. Sunny Jane Wise, who is lived experience educator on Instagram, says, I don't need to label something as a disorder to acknowledge how disabling it can be, which is kind of also in the same vein. And while I understand all of these concepts, and I am to some degree inspired by this idea that we can reject the idea of what is disordered and what is not, I get a bit caught up in the weeds here because I feel like this rhetoric exists at a crossroads of two different approaches to disability advocacy, and it could be really reasonably explained as to fitting into either camp if you tried hard enough. So I think we're going to start with the models of disability and then see where that gets us in working through this here. So the medical model of disability is a way of looking at disability that says this is a thing that is broken and that needs to be fixed in order for the person to live a happy and healthy life in our society. And then we have the social model of disability, which is a way of looking at disability that says our society is a thing that is broken, and if it were accessible to disabled people, we would not be disabled or feel that we need fixing. And as very basic concepts, these things are quite helpful and can be a really useful framework for understanding different views of disability. I tend to lean more toward the social model, particularly in educational settings, because the idea that disability is primarily environmental rather than individual is a very new concept for a lot of people. But I also feel that these models are very simplistic to an almost unhelpful degree. I think everybody agrees on that at this point. And there have been other models since then that are a great deal more nuanced, but I still find the conversations tend to sort of more or less boil down into choosing between one of these two. And I feel like much of the conversation around rejecting the idea of disorder leans very hard into the social model, and particularly in the harmful assumption that disability as a concept only exists because of capitalism and oppression. Disability as a term and as a grouping more or less only does exist because of capitalism, but disabled experiences exist in every single economic system in the world and have for all of history and all of time. Even if I were able to accommodate every single aspect of myself, I would still get migraines when we get hurricanes. We can argue that maybe it would probably be less disabling in a different world where I wasn't expected to have to work every single day, so it'd be like easier to rest when I have a hurricane migraine, but having a migraine would still hurt and it would still be unpleasant and it would still get in the way of me doing what I want to do. And I think with mental disability in particular, this desire to separate from the concept of disorder and disability is a bit naive at best and actively throwing people with higher support needs under the bus at worst. And advocacy work should primarily find its basis and grounding in the most marginalized members of our communities, which is inherently those with higher support needs. And also those intersectionally, like disabled folks of color and disabled trans folks and all that kind of stuff. This discussion of disorder also often implies that disability is and has always been a reclamatory word that highlights difference, which I don't find to be incredibly fair or particularly historically accurate. The disability rights movement, part of which worked to reshape that word and its connotation connotations only started in the 1960s. And Lawrence Carter Long created the hashtag Say the Word campaign in January of 2016 with the tweet, "If you see the person on the disability, you're only getting half the picture. Broaden your perspective. You might be surprised by everything you've missed. Disabled. Hashtag Say the Word," which fundamentally changed how that word has been used and viewed in much more recent history. And this word has been around since like the 1500s, and it has had lots of connotations before we started to reclaim it in the 60s and up until now. And as much as we can argue that disorder is inherently negative because it implies that something is wrong or broken, we can say disability is inherently negative because it implies that someone is unable to do something. But linguistically, over the past few decades, we have changed disability to be a neutral, if not positive, descriptor instead. And where my view of advocacy even further gets wrapped up in this is that there are sort of two different ways to look at disability advocacy work. One that says, I don't have something wrong with me, I'm just different. And another that says, does having something wrong with me make me any less of a person or my life any less valuable? And I personally find the second view to be infinitely more freeing and also more equitable and inclusive of all disabled experiences, because we're not saying being impaired is terrible, how dare you call us impaired. We're saying, yeah, we're impaired. So what? Which I feel is deeply empowering and also better includes those with higher support needs than an argument as to why we're actually not impaired in society that's impairing us. Why would you ever say that? Which is affirming to some degree, but also feels a little bit more like we're trying to argue ourselves to a new place in the system that exists rather than just questioning the system altogether, if that makes sense. And there's a lot of history in trying to destigmatize mental disability, the most well-known being the concept of mental illness and mental health that created an easy way to understand it. Just like, you know, sometimes you break your leg and you get a cast, it takes time to heal. Sometimes people's brains struggle with something and then they work through it, and those two things are just as real and valid as one another. But the issue with this view is that it leans very hard into the realm of mental difference is something that needs fixing, which, while it did get rid of stigma a little bit, in that it initially began more conversations on this matter, which is important and great, it more strongly embedded the stigma of mental disability being a deviance that needs fixing. A lesser known history is that of Mad Pride, which I don't know why I haven't really talked about on this channel before, but we're gonna do it and it's gonna be great. Mad Pride is a bit of a complicated concept to entirely pin down, but it generally aims to separate itself completely from the medical framework of mental difference and instead use a term that was never medical and still objectively isn't. I also like the use of mad because it is a much older word than really any of the other words for mental disability that we have in use today, so it feels like it has a whole line of ancestors behind it in a way that I feel honors that we've always been here and we always will be, which I quite like. It feels like it has more weight to it. Mad Pride focuses on creating tools and resources and pride for people to learn to live with their mental differences rather than trying to make them go away, which some argue is inherently dangerous rhetoric, but I've always seen it used in a way that I personally feel is very middle of the road in that regard. Like, they're not being like, oh, if this is hard for you, you should just learn to be proud of your difference and get over it, because even if it's destroying your life, but instead being a lot more holistic in its approach with the goal of wanting people to work with their body minds in a way that makes life easier for them to manage day to day and not feel ashamed for the aspects of their difference that aren't causing active harm to them or to others. A great example of this is the Hearing Voices movement, which focuses on helping provide support for those who hear voices, on how to manage them and integrate it into their daily existence so they're no longer actively distressing to those who hear voices, all while creating community and actively unpacking the stigma around people who hear voices. Mad Pride acknowledges that mental difference may not inherently be disabling, and there is much to be celebrated in the difference that is being mad. I also find that its approach to the social model is a good deal more realistic in that it says, like, a lot of the problem at hand is due to lack of accommodation and support in society for various things, particularly around socio-emotional tools, and acknowledges that many things seen as symptoms of madness, such as like withdrawal from society or anxiety, for example, might actually be a reasonable response to it. Experiencing distress, however confusing that might be to others, is a human experience and should be responded to with compassion, love, curiosity, and empathy, not fear and stigmatization. Instead of jumping to conclusions that there is something wrong with the person, this could be viewed as a way of communicating pain, processing trauma, or being at a life crossroads where significant change is needed. This doesn't mean no supports are needed. However, MAD activists ask that human experiences are not pathologized or psychiatrized. Mutual aid and peer support might be ways of providing more meaningful supports than psychiatry in times of distress or overwhelm. MAD Pride finds its roots in the psychiatric survivors movement of the late 1960s and 1970s in response to the civil rights movement, disability rights movement, and mass deinstitutionalization in that era. I have a history of institutions. I will link that above for you as well. I also have a history of the disability rights movement. I'll also link that above, and I'll put all these in the description for you too. And this movement created terms like mental health service user and mental health service consumer as a replacement for words such as patient that take away the autonomy of the mad person, though many people prefer to use the word psychiatric survivor to acknowledge and push against the inherently carceral aspects of the mental health system as it currently stands. Judy Chamberlain's book On Our Own: Patient-Controlled Alternatives to the Mental Health System, published in in 1978 became the core intellectual text of this movement around creating autonomy for mad people seeking care and support, as well as crafting community and pride around that difference. Mad pride as a specific term became a thing in 1993 in Toronto, and in 2000 there was a book published titled Mad Pride, A Celebration of Mad Culture. And some articles you read on Mad Pride will talk about it in the past tense as if it no longer exists, and other people will talk about it in the present tense as if it does exist. I would argue that it very much still exists, even if that's not maybe necessarily the language that we're using, but I feel that this movement is kind of getting revitalized of late. But maybe that's just my own bias and how I'm looking at the world. In regards to ways of reducing stigma and the community taking control of medical categorizations, I should also of course mention the neurodiversity movement that also began around the same time and also celebrates mental difference and treats it as something that is a different sort of normal. And when I was trying to explain the difference to a friend between the vibes I get from neurodivergence versus the vibes I get from Mad Pride, I said they both generally are for the same cause, but neurodivergence is like organized charity and Mad Pride is mutual aid, particularly because neurodivergence is often being co-opted under the pathology paradigm and becoming a strict label that is often used to make people more comfortable around a concept rather than to completely break free of the concept itself, which, to be clear, is an important stepping stone, and sometimes for particular things, a stricter use and view of labels as is afforded by neurodivergence is actually more helpful in certain situations. I'm not saying that neurodivergence as a movement is inherently bad, and I personally as an academic very much exist back and forth between the two depending on what particular job I'm working on at the moment and what framework is thus needed in that space. But I do feel for me the difference between the Mad Pride movement and the neurodivergence movement really illustrate the differences in mindset around and approaches toward the impairment paradigm. And I feel that 9 times out of 10 I'm going to go for the more holistic acceptance approach that isn't trying to fight against a system and instead just sort of opts in and out of that system as is needed for the best community care and quality of living. Is that more of a messy gray area than set labels and understandings of things tend to be? Absolutely, but that also, at least to me, seems to reflect the needs of my community the best. So if I had a choice about what to do with the entire disability movement, please never put me in that position. There's no universe where I would ever want that. Also, how would I get there? Anyway, my argument would be that we acknowledge the messiness and the nuance of the word disorder, but generally see it as a neutral term, much like we have done with disability. I also feel that the Mad Pride view of disability is what I practice in my own daily life, while neurodivergence is more the framework I use academically, if that makes any sense at all. But also at the same time, some people use neurodivergence to mean Mad Pride and its values, and others use it differently in a more pathologization heavy way. So even that is deeply complicated and messy. And I'll be fully honest with you, this opinion on the word disorder is not one that I had on this channel in much of my earlier content, so that may feel somewhat inconsistent with older things of mine, because at face value, somebody deciding what is or isn't disordered feels icky and bad, so I was very quick to reject it, as many members of the community are. Personality disorders in particular as a title irked me for years, and I would often poke at that on my channel in the first couple of years, but I feel that in really working through all of this, reframing disorder as a more neutral term is the best option. Not just because who's to say impairment makes a life any less valuable or worth living, but also because I feel that using the word neutrally actually helps with the stigma and to regain control of who are you to decide what is and isn't disordered in a way that I find rather empowering. Conceptually. It's gonna take me some time to like work that into my vocabulary and actually feel like that's the case, but I think I like it better than the alternative. We could use a word and acknowledge both how it is flawed and how it opens up supports and resources for someone. The word disability is like that. The word autism is like that. A lot of words function like that. And I think what's most frustrating to me about this whole conversation is how the use of the word disorder or opinions around it has become a sort of value judgment on somebody else's disability politics, a sort of metric as to whether somebody's really abolitionist and neurodivergence affirming in their advocacy. And that's also something that I feel to some degree shaded how I would view people as well. I know that there are certain things that if I see somebody use that language, I will be turned off by what they're saying. But particularly with disability advocacy stuff, especially the mental disability side of it, things are changing so rapidly and ideas are changing so rapidly and the definitions of words are changing so rapidly that everybody has slightly different definitions and understandings of things as they change and expand and grow in a way that makes standardization very, very difficult at the moment. And I feel that we're at a point where arguing the medical model versus the social model isn't a particularly helpful use of time or energy, because we know how much expansive nuance there is in all of this, in all of these situations, that a model or a strictly defined label is never going to be able to completely cover. I more made this video arguing terms and usage of them as a way to talk about how we look at our biases around difference and impairment, not because I feel an argument on nomenclature is particularly interesting or necessary right now, because I don't think that it is. But I feel that I have sorted through some of these tangled thoughts on the matter. I hope that I was able to give you some things to think about. And if there are aspects to this that you feel that I forgot to include, please do let me know in the comments. I would love to know your thoughts on all of this. Also, while you're down there, you can find my source list and the link to my Patreon if you want to help support me to be able to continue to make these videos. And I believe the like and subscribe buttons usually exist down there as well. Wild how that happens. But anyway, in the meantime, Thank you for being here. Thank you for being. Remember that critical thinking is really sexy, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.